Hi, Kate here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. This video today is a version of my previous video on the Ukraine crisis. After I made that video, I realized there's points I wanted to make. The video hasn't gotten a lot of views, and I get that it's an hour and a half long, and it is asking a lot of people to watch an hour and a half long video. I get that. There's still some points I wanted to make and some things I wanted to add in a much shorter version of it. So here it goes. And again, if you like my content, please, if you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. I'm going to try to keep this under a half hour. I'll see how it goes. Okay, so as I said on my previous video, Russia and Ukraine are sister countries. They're closely related. They have a common origin. The first Russian state was centered around Kiev. It was called the Kievan Rus. It was founded by Swedish Vikings in the 10th century. The Varangians, they developed these trade networks along the rivers of Russia, the Dnieper and the Dniester and so on. Center was in Kiev. It was a big area, covered a big area, covered a large part of what's now European Russia. Okay, so Kievan Rus had huge cultural influences from the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire to the south of them. They wars with the Byzantines, but they also did a lot of trade. They were converted to Christianity by Vladimir the Great, and around 980 AD, don't quote me on that, but around 980 AD, Christianity was actually resisted. It was resented, and there were rebellions against it, but it was more or less, became Eastern Orthodox Christian from the Byzantines. The alphabet came from the Byzantine, the Greek alphabet. Cyrillic alphabet is a version of the Greek alphabet. Okay, well, the state began declining. The Kievan Rus began declining in with the 11th to 12th centuries. Combination of reasons, partly because the Byzantine Empire itself was declining. Constantinople was losing control over its hinterland, and trade dried up with Kievan Rus. This is one thing that was happening. The inheritance system created a lot of instability among the aristocracy. It became a very chaotic situation. Also, slave raiders, Turkic slave raiders who surrounded them destabilized it. People fled away from Kievan Rus, fled north. Peasants fled north to escape this. This was a destabilizing thing, and the state began disintegrating like late 11th or early 12th century. Finally, in was about 1230 was the Mongol conquest, which kind of finished it off. The Mongols conquered, Genghis Khan conquered that area. It quickly became morphed into what's known as the Tartar yoke. The Tartars are actually a different group than the Mongols. Are a Turkic-speaking group. They kind of were allied and dovetailed up the Mongols. So the Tartar yoke ruled Russia for about 250 years. This was a huge influence on the development of Russia and the Russian state. Moscow, there were various late Kievan Rus period. There were statelets like states or polities that spun off. The biggest one was Novgorod, which was a merchant republic. It was part of the Hanseatic League, one of the Baltic, mostly German states, trading states, among the Baltic Hanseatic League. There were other states as well. Well, the Tartar yoke for 250 years had different effects. It bolstered Moscow, the Duchy of Moscow, one of the statelets as a dominant state. They were kind of vassals to the Tartar, and in return they had authority among the Russian states. Tartar yoke was finally broken. The rebellions finally broke in 1480 by Ivan III. In Russian, his pronunciation is close to Ivan. It's a form of the name John. So Ivan III broke the Tartar yoke. I believe it was his grandson, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny in Russian, was the first Tsar. Tsar comes from the word Caesar, form Caesar. He was the first Tsar. Declared himself the Tsar. He bolstered the authority of the central Russian state and really created what became the Russian Empire. It really crushed or assimilated these other statelets. He had a big power struggle with the boyars, this landowning elite who at the time were the tools of foreign powers. There's a great movie about him by Sergei Eisenstein called Ivan the Terrible. It's in part one, part two. I just saw part one. Okay, so Well, when Ivan the Terrible was consolidating the Russian Empire, he had resistance. There was another center around what's now Lithuania. Believe it or not, Lithuania at the time was a major power, and they vied for influence with Moscow. They couldn't conquer. The Russian state could have formed around Lithuania, as bizarre as it sounds, but the only stumbling block was that the Lithuanians wanted to keep Catholicism. If they converted to Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox religion, it would have worked, but they didn't want to give up their religion. So a long, complicated story, but Lithuania and Poland merged. There's a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Okay, while that was going on, what became Ukraine kind of spun off, became occupied by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They beat back the Tartars from Ukraine. They did beat back the Tartars, and much of the aristocracy kind of converted to Catholicism and sort of became Polish in the matter of speaking, like what they call Ruthenian, which are like Russianate speakers, Russian-leaning speakers. They often became assimilated to Catholicism into Poland. So there was a cultural dividing line. So most of the peasantry of Ukraine and Belarus as well remained Eastern Orthodox. So the church hierarchy kind of was in communion with Rome, as like the Uniate Church. So anyway, became spun off as a somewhat different identity. However, slave raiding was from the Ottoman Empire was a huge problem. I mean, the Ottomans at one time controlled a big chunk of Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe, and that was a big problem. And the aristocracy either couldn't or didn't want to protect the peasantry from that. So the rise of the Cossacks, the 16th, 17th century, we don't know where the Cossacks came from exactly. They may have had a Turkic origin, but they quickly became majority East Slavs, Eastern Slavic, and they were Eastern Orthodox. They fought. They actually fought against the Poles, and they were formed in Ukraine, also in Russia as well. Ukrainian Cossacks became a big part of the Ukrainian national identity. They fought against Poland. They also fought against the Russian state, the Russian Empire, where it was coming in and assimilating Poland. The Cossacks fought against this, but finally Russia was able to assimilate it, like around the 18th century or so. Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire had huge expansion throughout Siberia. It's pretty amazing history. Russian history is very compelling, very complicated, take a while to explain, but okay. So there were some promises made that when Ukraine was absorbed in the Russian Empire, that Russia would respect their culture, the local traditions. They kind of weren't actually, but also a large area of Eastern Poland was kind of abandoned, slave raiders and wars. There was resettled by ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and today it's called Novorussia, dates from Catherine the Great. And Crimea, a little while later, the Turkic groups were pushed out of Crimea. The Ottomans or other Turk groups had fortresses and had bases. They were pushed out of Crimea, and it was settled by Russians or Russian-speaking people. So that's why it became a little different. Okay, so for the most part, Ukraine actually hasn't been fully independent. Like after the Soviet Union broke up, Ukraine was the longest period of independence that the Ukraine ever had. They were few independent on and off. So anyway, fast forward. So I didn't mention last time serfdom. While it was kind of dying out or becoming less and less severe in Western Europe, same process led to it being strengthened in Eastern Europe. There's a rise of a business class, a bourgeois class in Western Europe. They brought raw materials, timber, coal, mining from Eastern Europe. And this encouraged the landowners to fasten serfdom more severe on their own peasantry, just as it was dying out in Western Europe. Interesting process there. I'm not sure how this affected Ukraine. They had the Cossack tradition, so I get the impression serfdom wasn't as severe in Ukraine. It lasted in Russia for something like 300 years, for like really, really long time. But as centuries wore on, became more severe in Russia. Although peasants, one of the motivations for colonizing Siberia was to get away from serfdom, escape from that. Anyway, serfdom was finally abolished in Russia, like I believe it was 1867, was the emancipation. Serfs were technically free. There were a zillion legal obligations holding them, binding them to their village. So like nominally free, but they were very heavily to buy the right to leave. They existed until pretty late. So like, roughly 70% of the Russian population were semi-slaves until roughly, I think it was 1867. I could be wrong, but around the same time, the U.S. abolished slavery. Okay, so fast forward. I'm not going to go too much into the Russian Revolution. Really fascinating history. Most people don't know about the Russian Revolution, but there's tons of other Russian history, which is also equally interesting. Russian history is very compelling. Okay, Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War was very complicated and chaotic. In Ukraine, there's several governments which controlled Ukraine. There was a Ukrainian anarchist, Nestor Makhno, Makhno's army actually committed pogroms, massacres against Jews. Makhno and his wife sincerely tried to stop it, but they couldn't. His army was out of control. Also, there was Ukraine for a couple of years, had like a kind of an odd socialist government. Dominant figure was a guy named Simon Petalora, and it was kind of a socialist government, but did not want to join the Soviet Union, stay out of the Soviet Union. I don't know a lot about the guy, enigmatic figure. Petalora himself has been accused of committing pogroms, massacres against Jews. He has his defenders, and I don't really know a lot about this. I'm not super knowledgeable about him. He fought against the whites, Denikin, but he also fought against the Bolsheviks. Ukraine was occupied by the Germans. They put in this pro-German puppet government. They exploited the hell. They went to use Ukraine for agricultural exploitation for the German army and defeat Germany. That was very unpopular. That collapsed. By the way, with I believe it's Petalora's government. Right before he fled, there's this odd story with Petalora government. The government put out this announcement that Kiev was going to be attacked by, I believe, this cosmic radiation weapon, newly invented cosmic radiation weapon. And during that day, everyone in Kiev should stay home, should stay in the houses, shouldn't go outside. And people believed it. This was coming right after the First World War, when there were weapons which seemed like science fiction. There was mustard gas, aerial combat, which people in the era seemed futuristic. It's the same thing. People believe the story, and that one day people stayed in their homes, and I believe it was Petalora fled Kiev, and his group entourage fled and took a lot of the gold reserves of Ukraine with them. And I guess the Ukrainian immigrant community in Paris used it. I don't know the full story, and I may be wrong about some details. I mean, looking through my books, I have seen this story, but I can't find it right now. It's difficult to find online. So if I'm wrong about some details, please correct me. Okay, Petalora himself lived in Paris by the Ukrainian immigrant community. He was assassinated, I think, in 1923 by a Jewish Ukrainian anarchist who blamed him. He said, "You killed my people," and shot him dead in broad daylight in Paris. He gave himself in. I don't know what happened after that, but interesting story. Not sure what to make of that, but okay. So yeah, anti-Semitism has been big in Ukraine at different times, and I mentioned the development of Ukrainian nationalism. Right now, saying a far-right wing slant. Some Ukrainian nationalists have been on the left, but okay. So fast forward. Collectivization didn't go very well in Ukraine or anyplace else. There were famines. As Trotsky said, Leon Trotsky said, it was a one-sided civil war. It was horrifically botched at the very least. There's the idea of the Holodomor, which is a artificially created famine directed against Ukraine. It's popular among right-wing historians and Ukrainian nationalists. I don't agree with this theory, but I'm not an expert. Kazakhstan and other areas of the Soviet Union also had waves of famine, so I don't think it was a great Russian attempt to exterminate Ukrainian people. I don't agree with that story. But okay, anyway, when the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded, 1941, when they invaded Russia, when they invaded the Soviet Union, originally some Ukrainians welcomed them welcomed as liberators. The collective farms were widely hated. People did welcome them as liberators. That very quickly wore off as it became apparent the Germans wanted to exterminate and enslave them. And there's a really brutal war, partisan war. Great film called Come and See. It was a 1980s film. Most of it is about partisan warfare. It's probably one of the best war movies ever made. It's very graphic. It's disturbing to watch. Most of it takes place in Belarus, not in Ukraine, but it's very similar to partisan warfare. And it graphically shows how atrocities committed by the Nazis. Okay, anyway, fast forward. After the Second World War, the Soviet government attempted to be a little nicer to Ukraine. Ukraine was built up, it was more prosperous. Ukrainians were overrepresented in science and the arts and culture. At one point, I'm not sure the year, but Khrushchev and Nikita Khrushchev actually gave Crimea, which was Russian, ethnically Russian, gave it to Ukraine kind of as a birthday present. Now, Russian culture, and when birthdays are big in Russian culture, when it's your birthday, you don't get presents, you give presents. You invite like a small circle of friends and you give them presents, like honoring them for being your friends in the past year. You give presents, you don't get presents. So Khrushchev actually gave Crimea to Ukraine as a birthday present, and there's some complicated politics behind it. I don't know if the people in Ukraine, in Crimea were consulted about it, but anyway, at the time it didn't mean a lot. It was like an administrative gesture. Anyway, okay. Fast forward, I'm not going to go through the collapse of the Soviet Union later period, except that Yeltsin and the group around him, thought they could do better under capitalism. There was a gigantic garage sale, living standards plummeted, and one of the biggest collapses in history. Male life expectancy plummeted. It was massive corruption, horrific time, a horrific situation. Both Russia and Ukraine were taken over by very corrupt oligarchs, became semi-gangster states. Putin changed. He became kind of what you might call an oligarchical Bonapartist. He crushed some of the oligarchs, consolidated, co-opted others. He had industrial consolidation, like under the Yeltsin period, is horrific. Was looting massive Western companies, and Russian oligarchs were looting the country. There's a Time magazine headline of the rape of Siberia. It was horrific. Living standards plummeted while a small group of oligarchs looted the country. Neoliberalism on steroids, the Washington Consensus. Well, Putin came in 1999. He kind of put a stop to this, blocked the Western penetration of some parts of the Russian economy, sort of developed kind of partially renationalized some industries. There was some economic revival. Like Russia became more of a primary product producer, or exporting oil, natural gas, and there's some revival of prosperity. It wasn't like the horrors of the early mid-90s. Okay, so, and there was tension developing with the U.S. in the 2000s. As this happened between Russia and the U.S., NATO was continuing expansion. There was a verbal promise between George Bush the first and Boris Yeltsin, Gorbachev, and then Yeltsin, that Ukraine would not expand. This promise was quickly broken. NATO, a few countries were joined. I think it was in mid-90s. Everybody said, it's inconceivable. Poland will never be in NATO. But sure enough, Poland was in NATO. Under Bill Clinton, actually 12 new countries on the borders of Russia and Eastern Europe joined NATO. And joining NATO meant, of course, there were U.S. troops, U.S. and British troops there pointed at Russia. And there's heavy CIA and British intelligence penetration of the state. It was pointed directly at Russia. This is the historic invasion route. They invaded twice in the 20th century, once in the 19th century, several times earlier. Historic invasion route. Putin, by the way, came from Leningrad or St. Petersburg, and they had the siege of Leningrad, like 900-day siege. The German invasion is is ingrained in the DNA of everyone in Russia, particularly in St. Petersburg. And, you know, this was just before Putin was born, or I don't know how old he was then, but it's sure his family lived through it. Everyone has grown up with stories of this. It's deeply ingrained in the mind of everyone there. Western expansion, they mean us harm, and we have to protect Russia. Is deeply ingrained. It's a horror that the people went through, a very emotional thing. So NATO being continuing to expand, Bill Clinton, like 12 more countries, including former Warsaw Pact countries. Only the Baltic states joined NATO, which were former parts of the Soviet Union. And Russia was kind of passive in some ways. Russia protested, they vociferously protested, but they weren't in a situation to do much about it. Really, they were still very much the defeated power in the Cold War. Okay, so there was not sure the days, the Magnitsky Accords, which were, I believe, under the Bush administration. Really, really complicated. There was some political American businessman, like William Browder, who interestingly was a very corrupt businessman in Russia. He very interestingly was I believe the grandson of Earl Browder, the American Communist Party leader. Anyway, this Browder got involved in corruption in Russia. He was arrested, and the U.S. media made him look like he was persecuted. Basically, in the U.S. sanctions, the Magnitsky Accords, sanctions against Russia and against some specific Russian leaders. This was basically playing politics in Russia, U.S. was kind of upset at Putin protecting parts of the economy. It was no longer open to neoliberal penetration, and this was kind of attack against this. Relations were starting to sour. Okay, now, in 2008 was the Abkhazia Crisis. In 2008, 2009, war with Georgia. Kind of complicated. Okay, Abkhazia is a small country. It was part of Georgia, and Georgia was a Soviet republic. They're a different ethnicity. They're not Georgians. Georgia is in the Caucasus. They were part of the Russian Empire and became part of the Soviet Union. Abkhazia was an autonomous republic within the Soviet Republic of Georgia. They speak a different language. They actually speak Russian. They were Russified. They're not ethnic Russians, but they speak Russian. And anyway, after the Soviet Union broke up, there were tensions, growing tensions with the Abkhazians and the Georgians. Georgians didn't want to deny language rights, and the ethnic tensions spiraling. There were a lot of ethnic Russians in Moscow. I used to see this myself, a huge number of Georgians in Russia, small business people and traders and things like that. They were really harassed by the police big time. Other ethnic groups lived in Moscow, nobody cared, but they don't physically look Russian. Georgians are really interesting people. There's a Georgian restaurant in Moscow called Mama Zoya's. It's pretty wild. Georgian women are really beautiful, and the men are kind of very chivalrous around women, but also kind of aggressive. It's really interesting. They don't look like Russians. The women look kind of Mediterranean looking. The men are kind of hawkish looking face. It's interesting. Anyway, they're harassed by the police in Moscow all the time. Okay, so there are tensions developing, and NATO, U.S. was pushing, like, there were color revolutions around the borders of Russia and the former Soviet republics. There was a color revolution in Ukraine in 2005 or so. There was a color revolution in Georgia. Color revolutions, they drew in some legitimate discontent, but they mostly involved middle class elements. They did very, very legitimate, popular uprisings. They were not working class uprisings. They mostly drew on middle class liberal elements. They were very much supported by the U.S., the Endowment for Democracy, which was, like, as I say, CIA cutout, direct CIA involvement being very unpopular. So in the Reagan era, the Endowment for Democracy, and there were other CIA cutouts. This guy named Gene Sharp, he died a couple of years ago. He's a Harvard professor. He was a theoretician of the color revolutions. The name came from the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, led by Václav Havel, major popular uprising protest movement. It didn't have any economic direction. Havel just thought there could be like a better type of capitalism. They were very naive. Okay, anyway, so a conflict in Russia and Georgia, like around 2008, and there were ideas that Georgia was going to join NATO. That was stopped. Anyway, Russia kind of won. They beat back Georgia, and relations between U.S. and Russia were reached a really low point, extremely bad. Around that expansion of NATO, and then the Magnitsky Accords, and then it culminated in the Russian-Georgian War. Obama and Putin met. They like symbolically pressed the reset button. The reset was called, and supposedly put U.S.-Russian relations off to a new start. It was kind of impossible in some ways, but I believe there was a missile shield the U.S. was using in Poland, which essentially would give the U.S. NATO first strike capability. Very controversial. It was quietly shelved. It was planned during the Bush administration, supposed to be played in 2018. It was quietly shelved. I remember that. Though there is another missile shield in Romania, which is operational. It was put in a couple of years ago, as far as I understand. I'm not super knowledgeable about it. So anyway, so throughout the first couple of years of Obama administration, relations maybe got a little better with Russia. Then 2014 with Euromaidan, really, really complicated. I won't get into this too much, but there was a president was Yanukovych. He was corrupt, but he was democratically elected. He actually had been president earlier. He was overthrown in another previous color revolution called the Orange Revolution, sponsored by the U.S. Endowment for Democracy, Soros Foundation, etc. He was actually reelected, but the term was also his opponents were also very corrupt. There was a political crisis in Ukraine, like around 2008, I believe. The different factions. Ukraine is run by very corrupt oligarchs. Some of them more pro-Western, some of them more pro-Russian. It's more the connected to the business interest. They sell their mother for a buck. Okay, so 2014 things came to a head in Ukraine. There's simmering discontent for a long time. Yanukovych, the president, democratically elected president, he signed a trade agreement with Russia. They gave him a really good deal. The alternative was a trade agreement with the European Union, which kind of was popular in Western Ukraine. There was a culture divide, and they won illusions of joining the European Union with prosperity and freedom and cheap consumer goods. They had illusions in the European Union. The agreement with the Russians was actually a little bit better, but a mass protest movement emerged in Maidan's square in Kiev. Mass protest movement, very quickly being dominated by Nazi groups. The what party called Privy Sector, Right Sector, the Azov Battalion, Svoboda, which was a full-scale Nazi party. They toned it down a bit. Now it's a semi-Nazi party. They're openly Nazi elements. Not to mention character Stefan Bandera, who was a Ukrainian nationalist before and during the second and after the Second World War period. He was usually based in Poland, and he moved to Ukraine. He collaborated with the Nazis. He carried out massacres of Poles and of Jews. He wanted like Ukraine to be an ethno-state. He collaborated with the Nazis on and off for a while. The Nazis put him on. I say put him in a concentration camp at one time, but then he later, after the Second World War, he worked for CIA and West German intelligence. He was based in West Germany. And anyway, he was assassinated by the KGB in 1959. Anyway, he became revived by these Ukrainian nationalists around 2014, semi-Nazi groups. And it was pretty scary. It was really scary. And okay, one of their ideas, they want to actually ethnically cleanse the Russian-speaking population. Now, Ukraine, up to this, I've been to Ukraine in the 90s. Late 90s. I don't know it really, really well. I say people in cities spoke Russian at that time. There's Ukrainian was spoken in the countryside, but professional people, everyone in the cities spoke Ukrainian. It was, it was basically the language everybody spoke. But then there was a large Russian-speaking population in the eastern third of Ukraine. Okay, and there's very heavy intermarriage as well. They're not clear-cut, different identities, right? Very heavy intermarriage under the Soviet period and later as well. Very heavy intermarriage between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians. It's not a huge difference between the populations. Okay, so as Euromaidan thing, the Russian population was terrified, understandably so. Russia annexed Crimea, and I think there was a legal, legitimate thing for them to do. The U.S. media went berserk over it, but they had a referendum. People voted to join Russia. They were Russian. Okay, the referendum was rushed. You could say that. There were irregularities. Possibly vote rigging, media was manipulated. People oppose the annexation would be enough. Yeah, that's true. But I still think even with all that, the vast majority of the population did want to join Russia, and they should have that right. It was an emergency situation. These things are always very messy. It was a base at Russian naval base, Russia's only warm water port at Sevastopol in the Black Sea, that could have become a NATO base. It would have been a geopolitical catastrophe for Russia. So Russia, it was a logical thing to do, and I think they did the right thing. I support them. Putin held, now there's also a breakaway, the Novorossiya broke away two republics, also people's republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. Donetsk has an interesting history. It was founded, I believe, around the 1890s by this guy's Welsh industrialist named Hughes. I think it was John Hughes. It was really called Yuzhovka. It was planned city, a steel building city. It was built as a steel building city. It was renamed Donetsk later on, but it was built by this Welsh industrialist. Amazing engineering feat at the time. Okay, so anyway, there's a Donetsk People's Republic and a Lugansk or Luhansk People's Republic, and their ethnic Russians identify as Russia. They wanted Putin to annex them as well. Putin held back, didn't do it. Russia supplied them with some covert aid. Anyway, a full-scale war broke out. Civil war broke out in Ukraine. Like 10,000 people were killed. There was one instance with the Union Hall in Odessa, a city there. Apparently 39 ethnic Russians were killed. It was under attack by semi-Nazi groups. 39 people were burned alive. It's a huge atrocity. So there was the sides back down a bit. There was Minsk with the Magnitsky Accords, Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Basically, Ukraine kind of, Russia, between Ukraine and Russia kind of agreed to like have a kind of something of a federal system, agreed to a cultural autonomy, political and cultural autonomy, the eastern part, and it turned to be a ceasefire. Well, it never quite happened. There was a ceasefire, but Ukrainians never really agreed to do it. They still had this fiery rhetoric about pogroms against Russian speakers and so on. So it was a simmering, a very tense situation ever since 2014, on and off. The current president of Ukraine is Vladimir Zelinski. He's an interesting guy. He started out as a comedian and kind of a political satirist. He was in a movie, and the plot of the movie was how a comedian became a reformist president of Ukraine. He kind of played the same role himself. He's Jewish, and he kind of provides an ideal cover for what's basically a Nazi-sponsored state. And he quickly became just as corrupt as the people he was satirizing. I don't know who to compare him to, maybe an Al Franken figure. I'm not sure. Definitely not a Jimmy Dore figure, maybe kind of an Al Franken figure. Okay, anyway, he's very on the economy, especially after 2014. The economy of Ukraine continues to implode. It was bad before then. It's really bad now. The oligarchs got all their money out. It made potentially a fairly rich country, but it's desperately poor. Really, oligarchs massively looting the country, essentially. Country's very much a failed state. It's not a democracy in any sense. I mean, Zelinski arrested the leader of the opposition party who ran against him. I mean, it's not it's censorship, and journalists are routinely arrested and harassed. It's not anything like a democracy. We're not protecting democracy against evil Putin. That's total nonsense. Because Ukraine, Zelinski was involved in the U.S. election in 2020. Basically, after the what's called Euromaidan movement, which the U.S. was heavily involved in. There haven't been pogroms against Jews, but people are worried that may happen. Most of the anger is directed against Russians at this point. Okay, so, and of course, Ukraine, Zelinski was heavily involved in the 2020 election, so bizarre ways. After Euromaidan 2014, Ukraine became essentially U.S. satrapy, U.S. colony in a way. Biden was kind of the overlord. Biden, vice president at the time, was appointed as overlord. His son famously got a make-work job with the Burisma, petrochemical company. I got a sinecure, like paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for basically a make-work job. This became an election issue. Biden, as the vice president, he actually bragged about forcing Ukrainians to fire the prosecutor or the attorney general, guy named Slotkin, who was corrupt. And there's been lots of back and forth. Some people claim that it's done to protect his son. Other people claim that Slotkin was corrupt. And the European Union have been trying to get rid of them also, but there's more to it than that. Like everyone in Ukrainian politics is corrupt. They have to be. Yes, Slotkin was corrupt, but so is the person who replaced him, like everybody was. It was just what faction you're on. I don't know whether I really don't know whether Biden forced Slotkin out to protect his son. I kind of don't think that's a specific reason, but who knows? And of course, Trump famously was impeached over a bizarre phone call with Zelinski supposedly threatening to deny aid unless he did some political favors or got some dirt on Biden. I mean, the whole thing is like, and the people who are accusing Trump themselves, like Pelosi's massive insider trading in the stock market. The whole thing is like so fucking weird. Okay, anyway, the root of the current crisis in December of this year, Zelinski, president, had this like essentially document memorandum, essentially a roadmap of ascension to NATO, essentially a roadmap to join NATO. That was a red line for Putin and Russia. That was it. I mean, it was considered to be a huge provocation. There was provocations for years. The enemy alliance was on the very doorstep, provocation, sanctions, provocation after provocation. This was like the last straw, this massively heated up tension. So Putin's rebuttal was, look, they said essentially an ultimatum. Look, you need to give us some written, said to the U.S. really, you need to give us some written promises that Ukraine won't be in NATO and stop the militarization of Ukraine. Essentially, not even just Ukraine officially being in NATO, but unofficially in NATO. You need to, back the fuck off. And so there were a bunch of this was a shocker. This was a game changer. Was Russia becoming much more assertive than it previously had been, and there were a bunch of meetings in Biden, like mostly online, in Biden and Putin and different European leaders and Putin and so on. Leaders, I think 4 meetings between Biden and Putin. It was completely inconclusive. The U.S. refused to budge an inch, officially budge an inch. No, we will not make any promise. Blinken said, we will not make any promises about Ukraine joining NATO. That's totally their own decision. We will not make any. But on the other hand, other countries like Germany did kind of an end run. Germany, the new Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor of Germany, he said, war's not really likely. Even Zelinski said, you wish the media, U.S. media would kind of tone it down. We're not going to have an invasion. Where the other countries are trying to tone it down. Well, the U.S. and Britain massively ramped up the hostility. U.S. media was nonstop predicting an invasion. Russia's going to invade. Russia is like 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border. Well, some of the troops recently left. Some of the troops were there for training exercises. Okay, so what the whole thing is really about is the economist Michael Hudson says not conflict between the U.S. and Russia, so much conflict between the U.S. and its European allies, in U.S., France, and Germany, and not between the U.S. and China, but between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. The idea is to prevent bloc Eurasian integration. Like the nightmare is Germany joining in with Russia. Germany has technical know-how. Russia has huge natural resources. It's been a possibility for a long time, even like after the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks were really hoping for a successful revolution in Germany that could have helped Russia develop. That didn't happen. There was some cooperation later on between Russia and Germany, but didn't amount to a lot. Then, because the Germans invaded Russia, tried to take it over. Okay, so that would be the nightmare. So Michael Hudson, an economist, interesting guy. He's a Marxist of kind of unique variety. He says he's a classical economist. People ask what I am. I'm a classical economist. He says Marxism is the logical culmination of classical economics, like starting with Adam Smith and then David Ricardo. The big thing about classical Marx is a logical culmination of this. The thing about classical economics, it was against unearned income, like Adam Smith complained about a rentier economy, rentier class, and parasitic. Marx actually, interestingly, was, according to Michael Hudson, was big on free trade, really, for a time, really big on free trade, interestingly. Again, he was against unearned income. The logical culmination of this is surplus value, which is unearned income, which the capitalists get from the working class. Adam Smith had a version, actually first developed the theory of surplus value, and David Ricardo had a version, Marx had a different version of this idea that the working class is the root of all value. There were earlier schools of economics. The physiocrats group in France thought land was the source, was the root of value, but Marx developed that the labor power of the working class is the root of all value under capitalism. So some people would say, conflict between Russia and the US doesn't really matter, and matters, but I mean, it doesn't matter. They're both capitalist countries. They're both imperialists, and they're both supporting Nazis. Michael Hudson would say, no, Russia's capitalist, absolutely, but it's a different type of capitalism. US is in a period of decline. US, and Michael Hudson's book was Super Imperialism, great book. I read it years ago. He has a new and updated version of it, which I want to read, basically how US capitalism, US economic domination evolved after like Bretton Woods system collapsed in the early 70s, how petrodollars and Saudi Arabia is recycled to keep the value of the dollar up, stuff like that. Really interesting book. Won't get into it too much, but basically what happened is under neoliberalism, essentially the industrial plant of the US was exported first to Mexico and then to China. And it's supposed to be like in the economic theory of comparative advantages. The countries specialize in what they do best. The US is supposed to become a service economy. However, Michael Hudson says it's bullshit, really. What the finance sector is parasitic. Essentially, it's counted as part of the GDP, US GDP, like literally financing the debt, like debt collection agencies add to the GDP. People add overdraft fees to your bank account. That's considered service. The whole highly parasitic fire, finance, insurance, and real estate sector, which doesn't really add anything, is considered to be a service that adds to the GDP. So the way it's estimated is bullshit. The US really has massively declined beyond all statistical legerdemain. Okay, Michael Hudson explains this pretty well, and he does see signs, Russia is capitalist, but it's different from US capitalism. It's not neoliberal capitalism, it's capitalism, and it's run by oligarchs and horrific exploitation. Yes, absolutely, but it's sort of better than US capitalism in some ways. And he sees possibilities in China. China's possibly capitalist as well, but it's a highly, like Russia, highly state-directed capitalism. And Michael Hudson thinks it can provide the opportunities for developing socialism. He said that the Chinese word for economic Marxism is just the Chinese word for politics. I don't know if I fully agree with him. I don't know, but there's something to talk about. Anyway, so the nutshell is the whole root cause of all this conflict is the US wants to block Eurasian integrationism. Not against Russia, it's against Germany and France. There's a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the US is not happy about. China is working as one belt, one road initiative, massive integration of Eurasia. The US will be US has nothing to offer economically. Realize that wants to block any competitors, getting really, really vicious about it. All it can do is sanction, threaten war. So that's the situation we're in. I don't know what's happening currently, what this will lead to. US media keeps predicting Russia's going to invade. US badly wants the Russians to invade. I don't think Putin had any plans to invade. The US is trying very hard to goad him in, creating this very tense situation, like they're right now shelling. Ukrainians are shelling civilian areas of Donetsk and Lugansk, and they're evacuating civilian population from this region. There are rumors of a Ukrainian invasion, probably using Nazi elements. It looks like they're trying very hard to provoke the Russians to invade, and they're preparing. The US media is very tightly controlled, of course, and there's a reason constantly this invasion scare. They're building stuff. Average American people are pretty isolationist and really don't give a shit what happens in Ukraine or Russia. There's no reason to, but they're whipping up this, media is deliberately whipping up this hysteria over it, and we'll see what happens. Maybe the US is trying very hard to provoke Russia into a war. Putin is a little more wily than that. He does have other opportunities. They're actually, as Ben Norton said, Russia is being forced by material conditions to adopt the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, almost against their natural inclination. Putin is not a socialist, not an anti-imperialist. He tried very hard, like after in 2008, early Obama administration, he cooperated with US sanctions on Iran, cooperated with these sanctions, but never got anything out of it. And the logic of the situation is pushing Russia into an anti-imperialist situation, even against their own inclinations. Like the oligarchs would have been happy to integrate the West, and not allowed to. So we'll see what happens. There could be, I don't believe the U.S. media bullshit for 1 minute, but Russia has other options. They have additional military, maybe military bases in Cuba, in Venezuela, in some of the pink tide countries of Latin America, and Bolivia, and so on. A greater influence there. They could cooperate with China in an attack on the dollar. It would hurt them, of course, but the worst nightmare, Russia would invade. They'd be cut off from the SWIFT, the bank transfer thing. That would really hurt the Russian economy, but Russia could retaliate. There are other things that can be done besides a direct Russian military invasion. I don't really know. Anyway, just briefly, I'm almost finished here. A few resources, which I'm getting information from on this conflict. There's a blog called Moon of Alabama. It's written by a German guy. I think he's a retired aerospace engineer. He's anti-imperialist. I don't really know his politics beyond that. He dissects these narratives, kind of more or less sort of pro-Russian, pro-Chinese. Anyway, he's against U.S. imperialism. And the comments say, he's a long comment section, pretty large readership. Interesting. There's another blog called Vineyard of the Sacred, written by a Swiss guy who's a Russian nationalist, married to an American who lives in Florida. Really interesting. Interesting character. Some of his language is a little cringy, maybe borderline anti-Semitism, and I do feel uncomfortable with that. But his writing has a variety of people right there. It is interesting to read, and it covers. There are a few other sources. There's Strategic Culture, which is interesting book from a variety of viewpoints: anti-imperialist, anti-U.S. imperialism. So we'll see that if this goes. I think tensions are going to continuing to ramp up for quite a while. It does seem the U.S. is trying very hard to provoke a war with Russia. Putin is more clever than that. I don't think he's a diabolical figure ready to invade, like the media is trying to portray it. I think he has other sources, but may force him into a military incursion into Donbass region. I don't really know what's going to happen. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this and have a good day. Bye-bye.